In October 1989, a 17-year-old named Shannon Moseley was driving home from football practice outside Atlanta when a drunk driver T-boned his Chevrolet pickup at 35 miles per hour. It should not have been a fatal crash. The truck's gas tank, mounted on the outside of the frame, ruptured on impact, ignited, and burned Shannon to death in the cabin. By the time his family's lawyer found the internal engineering memos, General Motors had already known about the defect for 16 years. Sinister business, bankrupt empire. The truck in question was the Chevrolet C&K series pickup, sold from 1973 through 1987. It was the best-selling vehicle in America for most of that period. Roughly 10 million of them ended up in American driveways. The owners loved them. They were rugged, cheap to fix, and ran forever. And they had a problem the company would refuse to acknowledge for the next 20 years. The problem was where the gas tank lived. On the C&K trucks, GM engineers had mounted the fuel tank outside the steel frame rails. It sat just inside the truck's outer body skin, with nothing between it and an oncoming vehicle but a thin sheet of metal. Other manufacturers had moved their tanks inside the frame years earlier, exactly to prevent side impact rupture. GM did not. Internal GM engineering documents, eventually surfaced in lawsuits, would show the company tested the design before production. The tests confirmed the tank could rupture in a side impact at 20 miles per hour. One internal memo, dated 1973, calculated the projected cost of redesigning the tank position against the projected cost of paying out wrongful death lawsuits. The redesign was more expensive. Production went ahead, unchanged. The bodies started early. By 1981, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was receiving complaints about C&K pickups bursting into flames after side impacts. By 1988, the agency had opened a formal investigation. By the early 1990s, the Center for Auto Safety, run by a former Ralph Nader lieutenant, had identified at least 300 deaths attributable to the gas tank design. The lawsuits began to find the engineering memos. In 1993, a Georgia jury heard the Shannon Moseley case in full. They saw the cost-benefit calculation. They saw the side impact test data from 1973. They returned a verdict of $105 million in damages against General Motors, including a finding of willful and reckless misconduct. The verdict was eventually reduced on appeal. The finding was not. Then came NBC. In November 1992, the network's news magazine Dateline broadcast a segment titled "Waiting to Explode." It featured a televised side impact crash test of a C&K pickup. On camera, on schedule, the truck burst into flames. It was a powerful piece of broadcast journalism. It was also fraudulent. The Dateline producers, anxious that the test fire might not ignite reliably, had taped 2 small model rocket engines to the truck's underside and remote detonated them on impact. General Motors hired private investigators. They found the burned truck in an Indianapolis junkyard. They examined the chassis. They found the residue of model rocket engines fused to the metal. They tracked down the consultant Dateline had hired to set up the test. He confirmed everything. GM filed a defamation lawsuit. NBC settled within a week. 3 Dateline producers were fired. Anchor Jane Pauley issued an on-air retraction and apology to 24 million viewers. The Dateline disaster was, for General Motors, the gift of a generation. The fraud was now the story. The underlying defect, which was completely real, was now contaminated by the lie that had tried to dramatize it. GM lawyers would invoke the Dateline mess for the next decade in every courtroom they walked into. The journalists who had genuinely been reporting the gas tank story watched their credibility collapse alongside NBC's. But the federal regulators were not journalists. In 1994, after a 6-year investigation, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration formally concluded that the C&K pickup gas tank design was defective. The Department of Transportation, under Secretary Federico Pena, ordered General Motors to recall about 5 million trucks. The recall would have cost the company close to $1 billion. GM refused. The company hired Theodore Olson, the future U.S. Solicitor General, to fight the recall in federal court. The fight lasted 8 months. In December 1994, the federal government and General Motors settled. There would be no recall. There would be no formal admission of a defect. General Motors would pay $51 million to fund national auto safety education programs and to install fire-resistant fuel tank protectors in some emergency vehicles. The settlement was estimated to cost GM less than 2% of what an actual recall would have cost. By the time the settlement was signed, the C&K pickups had already been out of production for 7 years. But about 5 million of them were still on American roads. They would continue to drive American highways with the same gas tank position for another 20 years. The lawsuits did not stop. Individual wrongful death verdicts continued through the late 1990s and the 2000s. General Motors paid them quietly, one at a time, behind sealed agreements. The Center for Auto Safety would eventually estimate that the side-saddle gas tank design contributed to roughly 1,800 deaths over the lifetime of the C&K series. By way of comparison, the more famous Ford Pinto, the case study every law school still teaches, killed about 27 people from gas tank fires. The General Motors trucks killed at least 60 times that number. The Pinto is taught in textbooks. The C&K pickups are not. No General Motors executive ever faced personal criminal liability. The engineers who had run the 1973 side impact tests retired with their pensions. The lawyers who fought the recall went on to senior positions in the Bush administration and on the Supreme Court bar. The truck owners who lost children in fires got modest checks and gag orders. The Shannon Moseley jury verdict, the one that found willful and reckless misconduct by General Motors, was the high watermark of legal accountability for the defect. The Moseleys eventually settled their case for an undisclosed sum. They were required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They are not permitted to discuss what they learned about the company that built the truck their son died in. As of this recording, they have honored that agreement. Bankrupt Empire, Sinister Business, The Dark Side of Business. Subscribe.